For centuries, humanity has grappled with the unseen, with whispers in the dark, shadows that move on their own, and the chilling feeling of not being alone. We build our world on logic, on what we can see, touch, and scientifically explain. But what happens when the fabric of that reality frays? When encounters occur that defy all reason, leaving us with only one conclusion: there is something more. Something beyond our comprehension. The paranormal. Tonight, we step beyond the veil of skepticism. We've gathered 5 accounts from individuals who, like many of us, once scoffed at ghost stories, dismissed bumps in the night as old pipes, and rationalized every strange occurrence. Until they couldn't. These are not tales of legend or folklore, but personal experiences so profound, so deeply unsettling, that they shattered the barrier between belief and disbelief. Prepare yourselves for stories of persistent entities, unsettling predictions, inexplicable phenomena, and the chilling feeling of a presence that refuses to be ignored. These are the encounters that leave you with an undeniable truth. Some things simply cannot be explained away. And after hearing them, you might just find yourself looking over your shoulder, listening to the silence, and wondering if you truly are alone. My grandmother lived in this beautiful, old Victorian house that had been in our family for generations. It was a grand place, full of history and character, with creaky floorboards and long, winding hallways. As a child, I loved visiting. It felt like stepping into a storybook. But as I got older, I started to notice things that weren't so charming. My grandmother, a no-nonsense woman, would often talk to herself when she thought no one was listening. Not just muttering, but full-on conversations, as if there was someone else in the room. When I asked her about it, she'd just wave it off, saying, "Oh, just old age talking, dear." But her eyes would dart to a corner of the room, as if checking on someone. The house always had a peculiar cold spot on the second-floor landing, regardless of the weather. And sometimes, you'd catch the faint scent of pipe tobacco, even though no one in our family had smoked a pipe in decades. My grandmother would just sigh, "He's back again," and move on. The real experience that changed my perspective happened when I was 17. My grandmother had fallen ill, and I stayed with her for a few weeks to help out. One night, I was awake late, reading in my room. The house was utterly silent, save for the ticking of an old grandfather clock downstairs. Suddenly, I heard a distinct thump from the hallway, followed by a soft, dragging sound. It sounded like something heavy was being pulled across the old hardwood floor. My heart jumped. I thought maybe my grandmother had fallen, or was trying to move something. I quietly opened my bedroom door and peered out into the long, dark hallway. The only light came from the moon shining through the tall window at the far end. And that's when I saw it. Standing about halfway down the hall, directly in the cold spot, was a figure. It was tall and shadowy, indistinct in the gloom, but clearly human-shaped. It was wearing what looked like an old-fashioned, heavy wool coat, and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its face. It was just standing there, completely still, facing away from me, looking towards the window. A wave of pure, absolute dread washed over me. This wasn't my grandmother. This wasn't a shadow. This felt ancient, and it felt like it shouldn't be there. Every hair on my arm stood on end. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stared, transfixed by the silent, ominous presence. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly, almost imperceptibly, turned its head. It didn't turn its body, just its head, until it was looking directly at me. Even though I couldn't make out any features in the deep shadows of its hat, I felt its gaze on me. It was cold, piercing, and devoid of any warmth. It felt like being observed by something that had been watching for a very, very long time. Then, very slowly, the figure raised one long, shadowy arm. It didn't point or wave. It just raised its arm, with an almost imperceptible gesture, towards the empty wall opposite where it stood. A gesture of quiet, profound sorrow. And then, it turned its head back to face the window, and slowly, gently, began to fade. Like smoke dissolving into the air, it simply grew more transparent, until it was gone. I stood there, shaking for a long time. I eventually stumbled back into my room and locked the door. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, pale and rattled, I tried to tell my grandmother what I'd seen. She listened quietly, a distant look in her eyes. When I finished, she just nodded slowly. "That was your great-grandfather, dear," she said softly. "He loved this house. And he loved his pipe." She paused, then added, "He also loved his wife very much. She passed away in the room across the hall from you. He never really left. I never saw the full figure again, but after that, I understood. The cold spot, the pipe tobacco, my grandmother talking to herself. It wasn't old age. It was a lifelong conversation with a presence. A sorrowful, watchful guardian who loved his home and the memories within it. From that day on, I knew, with absolute certainty, that some spirits linger. They walk among us, unseen, tied to places and the people they loved. And sometimes, they let you know they're still there. When my wife and I bought our first house, we were thrilled. It was an old farmhouse, built in the 1920s, with a large, unfinished attic. We planned to convert the attic into a master suite eventually, but for the first few months, it remained a dusty, forgotten space, accessible only by a pull-down ladder in the hallway. The first strange thing happened a few weeks after we moved in. I was alone in the house, my wife was at work. I was cleaning downstairs when I heard what sounded like faint whispers coming from directly above me. I paused, listened. It was muffled, indistinct, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. I assumed it was the wind, or maybe the old house settling. But it happened again, and again, always when I was alone, always from the attic. And it wasn't just whispers. Sometimes, it was a soft, rhythmic thumping, like someone gently walking back and forth, or the distinct sound of something being dragged across the floorboards. I tried to rationalize it. Raccoons? Squirrels? But the sounds felt deliberate, not random animal noises. And the whispers were too consistent, too much like human speech. I mentioned it to my wife, Sarah, but she just laughed it off. Old house noises, Han. Every old house has them. One evening, we were watching TV when we both heard it. The whispers, louder than usual, and this time, the distinct sound of children laughing, coming from the attic. Sarah's face went pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We both sat there in terrified silence, listening to the disembodied laughter of children echoing through our home. It sounded happy, playful, but in the context of an empty attic, it was utterly terrifying. That night, neither of us slept well. The sounds continued sporadically, whispers, footsteps, the faint jingle of what sounded like small bells. We decided we had to investigate. The next morning, armed with flashlights, we pulled down the attic ladder. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light as we slowly climbed up. The attic was exactly as we'd left it, empty, dusty, with old insulation showing between the beams. There was no sign of animals, no nests, no droppings. Just a vast, cobweb-filled space. We searched every corner, shining our flashlights into every nook and cranny. Nothing. As we were about to give up, Sarah stopped. She was standing in the center of the attic, her head cocked to one side. "Listen," she whispered. I listened. The whispers were back. Faint, ethereal, all around us. And then, I heard it too. Not just whispers, but clear words. A child's voice, almost right next to my ear, said, "Wanna play?" I jumped, dropping my flashlight with a clatter. Sarah gasped. We stood there, frozen, in the dark, dusty attic, surrounded by invisible children. Then, a distinct, rhythmic thumping started up, directly above our heads, on the roof. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like someone was jumping up and down on the roof. We scrambled down the ladder, pulling it up and locking it into place, our hearts pounding. We didn't go into the attic again for months. The activity didn't stop. Sometimes we'd come home to find small, antique-looking toys that we didn't own. A tiny wooden horse, a porcelain doll's arm, placed neatly on our living room table. Once, I walked into the kitchen to find all the cabinet doors open, and a child's drawing of a stick figure family taped to the refrigerator, a drawing that wasn't there 5 minutes before. We eventually hired a local medium, a kindly old woman named Martha. She walked through the house, her eyes closed, occasionally pausing and nodding. When she got to the hallway, she smiled softly. "Oh, There are quite a few of them up there, she said, looking at the attic hatch. A family. The children love this house. They're just playing. She told us that a family with several children had lived in the house in the 1930s. There had been a fire in the attic, though not a major one, that had claimed the lives of the two youngest children. The parents had moved out shortly after. The children, she said, were simply still playing in their favorite part of the house. They weren't malicious, just present. Martha performed a blessing, asking them to find peace, but also acknowledging their presence. After that, the intense activity lessened. We still occasionally hear faint whispers or the sound of soft footsteps from the attic, especially late at night. But now, it feels less terrifying and more like a gentle reminder of the house's past. We never did convert the attic. It remains their playground. And we, the living, are simply sharing their space, learning to coexist with the invisible residents who just want to play. I've always been a vivid dreamer, but usually, my dreams are nonsensical, fantastical. Never have they felt real or prophetic until a few years ago. This experience completely shattered my skepticism about premonitions and the power of the subconscious. It started with a dream that felt incredibly real. I was in my childhood home, a place I hadn't lived in for years. The house was bathed in an eerie, sickly green light, and there was a pervasive smell of burning wood. I walked through the familiar rooms, calling out my mother's name, but there was no answer. The air was thick with ash. I eventually found myself in the living room. Everything was coated in a fine layer of soot. In the center of the room, on the coffee table, was a small, ornate wooden box that my grandmother had given my mother. It was open, and inside, glowing with the same sickly green light, was a single, withered rose. As I reached out to touch it, I woke up in a cold sweat. The dream was so disturbing, so vivid, that it stuck with me all day. I called my mother just to check in. She sounded fine, told me everything was normal. I told her about the dream, and she just laughed, saying I watched too many horror movies. I tried to shake it off, but the image of that burning house, the green light, and the withered rose wouldn't leave my mind. 2 days later, I was at work when my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was shaking, on the verge of tears. "The house," she choked out. "It's on fire." My blood ran cold. I immediately drove to her house, my mind racing. When I arrived, firefighters were still dousing the last embers. The damage was extensive, mostly in the living room and kitchen. The source of the fire was an old, faulty electrical outlet behind the couch in the living room. As I walked through the charred remains of the house with my mother, the smell of smoke and burnt wood filled the air. Everything was blackened, ruined. When we reached the living room, my heart nearly stopped. The ceiling above was open to the sky, letting in a strange, greenish hue from the overcast morning light. And there, in the very center of the coffee table, miraculously untouched by the flames, sat the small, ornate wooden box my grandmother had given her. It was open. My mother saw me staring at it. "Isn't that strange?" she said, her voice a whisper. "Everything around it is ruined, but not the box. And you know, I found it open like that after the fire. It's usually always closed." I walked over, my hands trembling. I peered inside the box. It was empty. There was no withered rose. But the box itself seemed to pulse with a faint, internal glow, a sickly green light that I knew from my dream. I didn't tell my mother about the full extent of the dream, about the rose, about the green light. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But I knew. I knew that dream wasn't just a dream. It was a warning, a glimpse into a future that was about to unfold. The house was eventually rebuilt, but the memory of that day and that dream never left me. I now pay much closer attention to my dreams, especially the ones that feel too real, too vivid. I don't understand how it happened or why I was shown that vision. But I know, without a shadow of a doubt, that sometimes the mind can glimpse beyond the present, touching moments that are yet to come. It was a premonition that saved me from the shock, from the disbelief, and made me a lifelong believer in the inexplicable connections between our minds and the events of the world. I used to work the night shift at a large university library. It was a quiet job, mostly shelving books and helping the few late-night students. The library was a grand, old building, with towering shelves and long, echoing corridors. Most nights, I was completely alone after midnight, and I loved the solitude. But sometimes, the solitude felt observed. It started subtly. Books that I had just shelved would be found on the floor a few minutes later, always open to a random page. Lights would flicker in empty aisles, even though the wiring was new. The old elevator, which was rarely used at night, would sometimes travel between floors on its own, its ancient mechanism groaning and clanking. I initially dismissed it as the quirks of an old building. Dust, drafts, electrical fluctuations, until the whispers started. They were faint, almost inaudible, like someone was speaking just behind me. I'd turn around, expecting to see a student, but there would be no one there. The whispers would fade, only to return when I was focused on my work. They weren't words, not really. More like a soft, breathy murmur, a constant presence. One night, I was in the most secluded part of the library, the historical archives section, deep in the basement. It was always colder down there, and the air was heavy with the scent of old paper. I was alphabetizing a collection of ancient maps when I heard a distinct sound from the next aisle over. It was the sound of a book being pulled off a shelf. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. I slowly walked to the end of the aisle and peered around. The aisle was empty, but on the floor, directly in the center, lay a massive, leather-bound tome. It was a centuries-old book of local history, one of the heaviest in the collection, usually kept under lock and key. It lay open to a specific page. My heart was pounding. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a draft. Something had deliberately taken that book down. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the dusty air. The page it was open to contained an old, faded photograph. It was a picture of the library's original head librarian, a stern-looking man with a severe expression and wire-rimmed glasses, taken in the late 1800s. As I stared at the photo, I felt a sudden, intense chill, much colder than the usual basement air. And then, I heard it again. The whispers. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were all around me, emanating from the shelves themselves, from the very air. And they were louder, more urgent. And then, a different sound. A soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the floor, right at my feet. I looked down. There, on the dusty concrete, a small, dark shadow was moving. It was a circular shadow, like a small, flat stone being dragged across the floor. It moved slowly, deliberately, drawing a series of perfect, concentric circles around my feet. I froze. My mind screamed run, but I was too terrified to move. I was trapped by an unseen force, surrounded by whispers, and watched by the silent, circular shadow at my feet. The tapping continued, the circles growing larger, encompassing more of the floor around me. Then, the circular shadow moved again. It stopped right at the edge of the open book, at the photograph of the old librarian. And from within the shadow itself, a deeper, clearer whisper emerged. It said, very distinctly, "He likes you here." I didn't wait. I let out a choked cry, dropped my flashlight, and bolted. I ran out of the archives, up the stairs, and out of the library, not stopping until I was in my car, speeding away. I quit that job the very next day. I never went back inside that library. I don't know who that watcher was, or why it chose to reveal itself to me. Was it the old head librarian, still tending to his beloved books? Or something else, something drawn to the quiet knowledge within those walls? All I know is that its presence was undeniable, its voice clear. And it made me a firm believer that some places are not truly empty, and some entities, once tied to a place, refuse to leave. They simply wait and watch, and sometimes they even interact. My father was an amateur radio enthusiast. He had a massive antenna in our backyard and spent hours in his ham shack in the garage, listening to distant signals and chatting with people all over the world. As a kid, I found it boring, but sometimes, late at night, I'd sneak into the shack and fiddle with the dials, listening to the static and garbled voices. One night, when I was about 15, I was messing around with one of his shortwave radios. It was around 2 a.m., and everyone else was asleep. I was just randomly turning the dial, trying to find anything interesting, when I stumbled upon a signal. It wasn't static. It wasn't music. It was a clear, steady voice. A man's voice, speaking in a foreign language I didn't recognize. What was strange was the clarity. It sounded like he was right next to me, not thousands of miles away. And his voice was calm, almost soothing, despite the unknown language. I listened for a few minutes, completely captivated. Then, the man chuckled softly, and in perfect, unaccented English, he said, "You're listening, aren't you?" My blood ran cold. I dropped the dial, pulling my hand away as if burned. I stared at the radio, my heart pounding. There was no way he could have known I was listening. No way. My father always told me you had to transmit to be heard. This was just a receiver. I scrambled to turn the radio off, but my hand was shaking too much. Just as I reached for the power button, the man's voice came back, this time a little closer, a little more insistent. "Don't turn it off. I have a message for you." I froze, my hand hovering. A chill ran through the warm garage. "It's about tomorrow," the voice continued, still calm, still soothing, but with an underlying current of something unsettling. "Your friend, Michael. Tell him to take the bus at 7:30. Not his car. His car will break down on the bridge. A serious accident. Tell him." And then, the voice faded, replaced by the crackle of static. I sat there in the dark, my mind reeling. Michael was my best friend. We were supposed to meet up the next morning to go skateboarding. He always drove. And the bridge, it was a notoriously tricky one on the way to the skate park. I spent the rest of the night debating. Was it a prank? Some weird, elaborate hack? Or something else? The voice had been so real, so clear. The message so specific. Despite my ingrained skepticism, a terrifying certainty began to grow within me. I had to tell Michael. The next morning, I called Michael first thing. I told him about the dream, the voice, the message. He laughed at me, of course. "Dude, you're crazy. I'm driving. My car's fine." I argued, pleaded, even threatened to ditch him if he didn't take the bus. He finally relented, annoyed but humoring me. Fine. I'll take the stupid bus." Happy now. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Later that day, I was watching the local news. The headline flashed across the screen, "Serious accident on bridge name." My stomach dropped. The report detailed a multi-car pileup caused by a sudden, inexplicable engine failure in one of the vehicles. The car was completely totaled. The driver was seriously injured. The picture of the totaled car flashed on the screen. It was Michael's car, the one he would have been driving at that exact time. I immediately called him. He answered, his voice shaken. He had heard about the accident from another friend. He had seen his car being towed from the bridge. If he hadn't taken that bus, if I hadn't made him. We both sat in stunned silence on the phone. Neither of us could explain it. How could that voice, through a random radio signal, have known? How could it have predicted such a specific event in such detail? From that day on, I stopped seeing the world the same way. The rational explanations, the coincidences, the dismissals, they all felt hollow. I never heard the voice on the radio again, no matter how many times I searched that frequency. But the experience fundamentally altered my perception of reality. I now believe there are forces, connections, and forms of communication that we barely understand. Some messages transcend time and space, delivered through the most unexpected channels, pushing us to believe in the true mysteries of the universe. And sometimes, those messages save a life. The human experience is filled with unexplainable moments. From the lingering presence of a loved one who refuses to truly depart, to the playful whispers of unseen children, the chilling accuracy of a premonition, the watchful eye of an entity in a library, and a disembodied voice on a radio, saving a life. These are the narratives that challenge our neat, scientific understanding of the world. They are the cracks in the logical facade, through which we glimpse something profound, something eternal. These stories, shared by those who live them, offer compelling evidence that the paranormal is not just a concept from fiction. It is a potent, undeniable force that interacts with our lives in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. They force us to confront the question, what if we're not alone in our perception of reality? What if the veil between worlds is thinner than we dare to imagine? What do you think? Did these stories sway your beliefs? Have you ever had an experience that made you a believer? Share your thoughts and your own paranormal encounters in the comments below. If these tales opened your mind to the mysteries of the unseen, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the true and terrifying. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey beyond the known. Until next time, keep an open mind, and remember, sometimes the most profound truths are found in the things we can't explain.